I imagine that the impression most of us have of the Apostle Paul is someone who is fearless in his proclamation of the gospel. That would be true, of course. Someone who is untiring in his efforts, but someone at the same time who is impervious to any criticism. We have this impression of the man of steel, of backbone, of courage in what he does. But in some ways that isn't the whole picture. It isn't a total picture of Paul. And when we see him in that way, we only see a one-dimensional character. However, from what he writes here, Paul seems to be in some respects quite a sensitive individual. For the sake of the gospel, he had suffered abuse. For the sake of the gospel, he had suffered insults in Philippi, as he had in other places. He had been flogged, he had been imprisoned unjustly, he had been humiliated and ridiculed. And in one way then it is remarkable that he should come, after suffering those things in Philippi, that he should come to Thessalonica and endure exactly the same things and begin again just that work of sharing the good news day by day, facing the same kind of opposition. Remarkable, that is, if it hadn't been for God taking a hand in this situation. Because of that, as Paul describes it in verse 2, he dared to share the gospel with the Thessalonians. Dared to, not only implying courage in what he did, but also the way in which he spoke, indicating the way in which he actually preached the good news. With clarity, with openness. He's not a man to be cowed into silence, but despite everything else, he hasn't lost the sense of call or the importance of the gospel, this view of the importance of the gospel. And though he's conscious of his own weakness, and very conscious here, he is aware also of the power of God and how that power has been manifest in his sharing of the gospel. He's seen and experienced the power of God, the transforming power of the gospel at first hand on so many occasions, even most recently in the prison that he left when the jailer was converted. And it is the power of the gospel that comes under the spotlight here in verse 2. At first glance, he writes that his visit was not a failure. And we take that to mean that it wasn't a failure in terms of the results. There were converts through his proclamation of the gospel. We read about that in Acts chapter 17. We read there how a few Jews, quite a number of God-fearing people, and then, as the Bible puts it, not a few prominent women, all came to faith. But that is probably, or potentially at least, not what Paul means here, because the same word could mean lacking in substance or emptiness or pointless. So what he's saying is that the gospel is not empty of substance, that it's not pointless, that it's not lacking in importance, that all of these, that the gospel is full of importance. And there is a point to him sharing this good news. And it adds to the point that Paul makes in verse 3 here, that his appeal does not spring from error. So it's not a pointless thing, and it does not spring from error. Perhaps then his opponents were saying something the same as those philosophers in Athens. You remember we read about that in Acts 17 as well. When Paul appeared there, they said, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Well, if I remember correctly, the word there, babbler, means something like twitter like a bird. So what's this man who's twittering like a bird trying to say? It's not like tweeting today, which, let's be honest, can be, I suppose, nonsense as well. Now, what he means then is that the gospel's not a matter of hot air. It's not a gospel that's lacking substance. Here is something that has importance. And because it is something with importance, something that has substance behind it, something that is vital, a message that is living, Paul then has the courage to speak in the first place. Now, it was that awareness of the weight of the gospel, of the importance of the gospel, that carried him forward, that distressed him whenever he saw in Athens a city full of idols and people who were so superstitious and so afraid that they might offend a God that they even had an altar to an unknown God. While his experiences must have shaken Paul and left a mark on him, it's clear here that he is confident in the truth and content of the gospel. There's absolutely no doubt in his mind. And that leads us to the next point, the purity of his motives. The three pillars on which his ministry rested in this respect, there are three pillars rather on which his ministry rested in this respect. It wasn't in error, which links to the importance of the gospel. He didn't speak in error. He didn't speak with impure motives, which he was accused of doing, which, when set against the background of the day and the behaviour of itinerant preachers in the area, generally hints at some kind of sexual impurity, which, as someone said, could have been the intention of those who were criticising Paul, because not a few prominent women were converted. Now, that said though, impure motives could cover a multitude of things, and how he was supposed to do this is in question here, because it says he was trying to trick the Thessalonians, and how that is the case is not made clear. But if he was trying to do any of these things, if his methods were in any way suspect, they weren't clearly working. His ministry had been opposed from the start. Christians had been persecuted in Thessalonica from the outset, and Paul had to be smuggled out of town at night, and that probably was the angle of attack from some of his critics, that he had run out on this infant church, that to save his own hide he had abandoned them to face the music. Now, all of this is addressed when he comes to speak about his character and conduct as he lived among the Thessalonians. But for the moment, we're going to leave it just at that point. We'll praise God in our song, and this week we're going to be led then after the song in our prayers by Lawrence and Lynn Gardner.